was loud, huh? Good evening and welcome to the special City Council meeting of March 31st, 2026. This is a joint meeting with City Council and Planning Commission with other board and commission members invited to attend. Welcome, everyone. City Clerk, please call the roll.
Turn the microphone on. That is step one. Okay. Council members present and establishing a quorum are council members Fulcher, Hanford, Walker, Fisher, Blair, Beaumont, and Gamble, who is attending remotely. Planning commissioners present and establishing a quorum are Lowe, Dawkins, Walsh, Lockert, and Balk. And I saw Commissioner Drews. Are there any other board and commission members present that I need to account for? Your name? Perfect. Thank you.
Did she get?
Any others? I see Doug Hobbs, and you are? Perfect. Thank you. I see Mr. Hobbs from LTAC is present, and I see an Eric, but I don't know if they are a board or commission member remotely. I will find out about that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Councilmember Fulcher, please lead us in the pledge. Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. The first item of business is public comments. This is a limited opportunity for people to speak to the council during the council meeting. Pursuant to council rules of procedure, oral public comment is limited to in-person comment only and must comply with the standards set forth in the council rules. Comments are limited to 3 minutes. Information on where to send written comments is on tonight's agenda and on the screen. Clerk, were there any written comments submitted? Thank you. Nobody signed up? Okay. Does anyone else in the audience wish to speak tonight? Okay, seeing no one wishing to speak, the public comments portion of the meeting is now closed. The next item on the agenda is announcements and presentations, a short course on local planning provided by the Washington Department of Commerce. Welcome. This is a joint meeting with the Planning Commission, and we've invited members of other boards and commissions. We will entertain questions from those board and commission members that are in person only. If other members of the audience have questions, please email them to cityclerk@monroelaw.gov. Okay, Ms. Turtellow.
Thank you, Mayor.
Yeah.
I just want to do a really brief introduction. The Washington Department of Commerce is doing a short course in local planning this evening. This program will be celebrating its 50th anniversary next year, so it's been helping guide City Council, planning commissioners, and Washington State for quite a while. With that, the Growth Management Act was established in the late 80s. Anyway, they'll go over that with you. And so because we have new commissioners, actually really no one knew, have all the council members been through a short course? Yeah, okay. So anyway, we just thought it was an appropriate time to just give you an overview of planning in Washington State. We do have, again, the Growth Management Act. And so with that, I'm going to hand it over to Jeff Atkins, who is the City of Monroe's representative at Department of Commerce. He coordinates with us on when we're passing new ordinances. So with that, I'm handing it over. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Kate. We're getting set up here. It's great to be out in Monroe tonight, so thanks for having us. And welcome to the short course on local planning. We're glad you're here, and we're glad to be out here to be able to talk to you. The short course has been presented in Washington since 1977, so next year will be 50 years of short course in our communities. It's something Commerce provides to communities and is always free and open to all, both council members, commissions, members of the public. And so we're excited to be here tonight. My name is Jeff Aiken, and as Kate mentioned, I am a senior planner at Commerce that works on our western team, so with cities in the Puget Sound area. I work with Snohomish County cities and a handful of King County cities as part of our growth management team. And I work with communities to help implement comprehensive plan measures and their development regulations consistent with the Growth Management Act. And prior to working at Commerce, I was a parks planner in the city of Redmond, so nearby. And then prior to that, worked at a few different nonprofits doing planning work. So I've seen a few sides. And in terms of background, have a master's of urban planning from the University of Washington. And so today we're going to hear about, let me scroll here, sorry. Used to Andrew's keypad. Hear about the basic set of land use laws in Washington State. We're also going to talk about the Growth Management Act. We'll have a brief break after those two segments and then proceed with the second half of the program, which covers effective meetings and open public meetings and an introduction to the Public Records Act. So a lot of information we will present tonight and try to hit all the high points and give you many resources that you can go back and look more specifically at RCWs where you can learn more about some of these things. So if you have questions on kind of the general issue we're talking about or it's not clear, please feel free to interrupt or raise a hand and we'll try to take those, and then general questions at the end of the presentation so we can keep on time. Andrew will be our timekeeper over here. And so our first speaker today will be Darren Carnell. Darren is a senior deputy in the King County Prosecutor's Office, where he leads the county's land use practice group. He represents King County on land use litigation and advises the King County Council, Permitting Division, and other county agencies on land use and environmental matters. He is admitted to practice in the Washington Supreme Court, the 9th and District of Columbia Courts, and the United States Supreme Court. Darren is a graduate of Yale University and the University of Washington Law School. I will do the second presentation tonight on the Growth Management Act and Comprehensive Planning. And then our third speaker to my left here is Andrew Ness. Andrew works for the Department of Commerce as an experienced outreach and communications professional. Andrew provides strategic support to the Growth Management Services Unit at Commerce, has over a dozen years of outreach and communications experience with 8 years in local government and 4 years working for the state. Andrew coordinates our short course across the state, providing direct support to communities around these trainings. He has a master's degree in public affairs from Washington State and a bachelor's degree in philosophy from the University of Washington. So thanks again for being here with us on the short course.
We're just going to pull up the other presentation real quick, because with that, we'll get started with Darren. I'm tech assist tonight, so give me 1 second.
Hi, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here in your beautiful city hall in your beautiful city. So I'm honored to be able to come out and talk to you. I have two portions of the presentation tonight. First, in this initial section, I'm going to give a high-level overview of the legal basis for planning in Washington State. And then later, I'm going to do a segment on the Open Public Meetings Act, the Public Records Act, and the Appearance of Fairness Doctrine. See, land use regulations, I think this probably goes without saying, has a really profound impact on our communities and the way we live. It significantly affects the quality of life. Here, the regulations are often complex and contentious. So it's, I think, critical to have an understanding of the regulatory framework and to understand how the processes protect both property rights and community interests. There are high stakes for everybody involved, for property owners, for neighbors, for the community as a whole. There's often, it takes a lot of work there's no easy answers, and it takes a lot of work to get to a solution that works for all, or something close to a win-win. I'll say that we work on lots of litigation in my practice, and if we have a lawsuit that's about money, whether it's a personal injury case or a contract case or something, those cases almost always settle, that we can almost always get to a dollar amount that the government's generally willing to pay and the claimant is willing to accept. Land use cases are about much more than money and things much more fundamental than money. And I think it makes it very difficult to sort of reach consensus and hard to resolve litigation. The consequences are longstanding, and the process and framework is both complex and critical. And I'll say the decision-making process and framework is critical in part because federal and state law impose significant requirements on the processes that local governments have to follow, and it's critical to follow those processes. But I also think there's a more fundamental value of the process, and that's that a quality process often might lead to a better decision and leads, I think, to broader acceptance of the decision. I'll say that I worked on both planning issues at King County and then on complex development projects that went before the hearing examiner. And I think many of those we were worried were going to result in litigation. But if there was a quality process and everybody felt like they had a fair shake, everybody got to go to the hearing examiner and raise their concerns about the project. I think the fact that people feel like they get a fair shake, even if the result isn't the result they were looking for, leads to greater acceptance, less likely to be litigation, and a more durable decision. So I know that say it simply, the process is a ton of work and it's a huge hassle, and there's lots of federal and state requirements, but I really think that there's huge value to that process. This slide just sort of gives an overview of the sources of planning and land use law, generally divided into three columns: the federal, state, and then local law. At the federal law, there's underlying federal constitutional rules, there's federal statutes and regulations at play. At the state level, the regulations are more robust. There's a state constitution and then many, many state statutes that local governments have to follow, and I'll say a bit more about those. And then at the local level, in land use planning, the local level is really where the action is. It's where most of the rules are. Cities and counties have comprehensive plans and development regulations. Of course, this body has a fair amount of discretion to determine what the local regulations might be. I think another sort of effect of the sort of unique local aspect of the decision making is that there's lots of different examples about how to do things. So if you're sort of faced with a difficult issue, that you can look at other jurisdictions and find other ways of approaching the same problem. I think that also affects the case law. One point I'd make as an attorney is sometimes you might hear about a court decision that was resolved a particular way and sort of be surprised about how it was resolved, and sometimes it seemed like a strange outcome. Sometimes it's just a strange outcome, but but it's not uncommon that the reason it's an outcome that's a surprise to you is because that the issue arose in a particular regulatory context, and the court's applying or reviewing a decision that was made by a different government that has different rules. And if that different government has different rules, the case might turn out differently than it would if, for example, it was a challenge to a decision that you all had made. So I think that appreciation for the significant local role and the variations in local government is key to understanding the regulatory structure. I'll give a little bit of history of modern zoning and planning. So the initial case and the seminal case is the U.S. Supreme Court decision in the city of Euclid, Ohio versus Ambler Realty. Euclid was one of the first jurisdictions to adopt a local zoning system. So as the name said, they divided the city up into districts: residential, commercial, industrial. And then there were rules about what not only what uses could go where, but what limitations were existent in the different zones, and what processes applied in different zones. And the Supreme Court said that this dividing a city up into zones is a legitimate exercise of governmental power. Of course, the land use system is significantly involved in the notion of strict rules about residential goes one place and commercial goes a different place. The substance has changed a lot, because now there's, for example, much more acceptance of mixed-use zoning where different uses are combined together. But the underlying principle is still critical, that establishing rules is a permissible exercise of constitutional authority. In Washington, as with the federal government, the state constitution provides that counties and cities can make police power and other planning and land use rules in their jurisdictions. And then there's, in Washington, a host of statutes that enable and limit the ability of local governments to enact particular rules. And I have a list here, and then I'm going to go through them in some of the more significant ones in a bit more detail. The Growth Management Act, I'm going to touch lightly on this because they're going to have a more detailed presentation on it in a moment. But the Growth Management Act establishes the structure for comprehensive planning in Washington. It's both a sort of a procedural statute. It sets forth a structure by which planning decisions have to be made. And then there's a substantive component. And this, I'll say the sort of leading substantive component has sort of evolved over time. You know, originally it was, the Growth Management Act was about protecting natural resource lands and concentrating urban growth in the cities. And then transportation and traffic for a while was a main Growth Management Act issue. And then water supply and became a big issue. And now the same GMA structure is being used to address housing, a significant issue where the state legislatures adopted rules that require more planning at the local level. And then next in line is a mandatory climate change element that jurisdictions are going to have to adopt. So the GMA framework was established in the early 1990s. The framework has remained in place. The issues have evolved over time, and it seems like the GMA is going to continue to be a tool to address what is ever viewed as being sort of the most critical planning issues of the day. The Shoreline Management Act, sort of as the name suggests, it's a companion to the Growth Management Act that applies to shorelines of the state. So, and that includes both shorelines of the Puget Sound and of lakes and major rivers and streams. The Shoreline Management Act is interesting for a few reasons. First, it's both a planning statute. It requires local government to have a master program that is sort of like a comp plan for shorelines. And then there's a regulatory or a permitting component that involves permits, substantial development permits, variances, conditional uses, all specific to the shoreline use. The Shoreline Management Act is also interesting because it has multiple objectives. Most environmental regulations, critical areas regulations, for example, are about protecting the resource from the impacts of development. And that's surely part of the Shoreline Management Act, but the Shoreline Management Act is also about using shorelines for recreation and for residential uses, and then it governs urban shorelines and industrial shorelines. So it sort of recognizes that shorelines are a precious resource, but are a resource that has a bunch of different objectives, and the Shoreline Management Act sort of has requirements for local government to do planning and permitting in a way that sort of balances those resources. The third interesting thing about the Shoreline Management Act is it has a much heavier state role than most other planning exercises. So for the comprehensive plan and local development regulations, for example, there's a presumption that they're legal upon adoption, and unless they're challenged to the Growth Board, the regulations just are effective. And the Shoreline Management Act, the master program, the comp plan, sort of a comp plan for shorelines, is never effective unless and until a state Department of Ecology reviews it and approves it. So the state has a bigger role at the planning stage, and then at the permitting stage, there's a special appeal process to the State Shoreline Hearings Board for some permit decisions, and some other permit decisions like shoreline variances are never effective unless they go to ecology for review first. So the state has a much bigger role in shoreline planning than other areas. The Subdivision Act, so this is a longstanding state statute that puts some limitations on local government and then requires local governments to have a process for subdivisions, so dividing a big piece of land into smaller pieces of land. I'll say this is one of the areas where there's been a lot of legislative activity recently, and the state has been looking at some sort of reform of the state subdivision requirements. And I think I have a couple points about that, is that this reform of the State Subdivision Act is sort of part of a broader theme in the legislature particularly for the last couple sessions, that housing and more housing quicker with a less expensive review process has been a significant interest of the legislature, and so there's momentum for reforming the subdivision statute. But the issue that I would flag for you to keep in mind is the subdivision statute and the local subdivision regulations have a purpose. They're about assessing the impacts that the new development has and making sure that they're addressed. And that could be traffic or safe passage to school or impacts on environmental resources. But the question is how if, for example, the subdivision statute is simplified and some of those regulations are pushed downstream, they might still have to be addressed just at the building permit stage. And so I think that's a question that I might ask is, if you're just simply, is there value to moving downstream in the review process where the impact is addressed, or are you just kicking the can down the road? I mean, what's the purpose of subdivision review? And that's subdivision reform, and that's an issue I would think about. The State Environmental Policy Act is sort of a procedural statute that sits on top of and supplements all other environmental regulations. The notion is that the most complex or impactful projects should have an independent review. It could be concurrent with regulatory review, but an independent review to assess what the impacts are, environmental impacts are, and then to inform the decision maker of those impacts so the decision makers can decide whether and how they should be addressed as part of rendering the underlying decision. And of course the SEPA touches local government in a bunch of different ways. I mean, first and foremost, it touches us as a regulator, that we're required to do SEPA review for most development projects where we're the permitting agency. It also touches us because we do our own projects. So for example, if a city or county is building a building or doing some other program or some other project, they're the developer, and they have a sort of a separate SEPA obligation to review the impacts and consider that in their decision making. And then finally, the local plans, so the comprehensive plan and development regulations are subject to SEPA review as well. SEPA imposes requirements on local governments in a bunch of different ways. It's not a substantive statute in that it generally doesn't drive the outcome decision. It's just about requiring sort of environmental analysis and collecting information so that that can be considered in decision making. The Local Project Review Act is a product of the 1995 regulatory reform effort. It was one of the times that the legislature thought that the permitting process was too slow and too expensive and adopted regulations to impose requirements on local review. That happened in 1995 when the Local Project Review Act was adopted. It's happened again in the last 2 or 3 legislation sessions where even stricter timelines were imposed by statute on local decision making in an effort to get permits out the door. I'll say that it's very, I think everybody agrees that no one is opposed to an efficient permitting process that's no slower and no more expensive than it needs to be. But the question is, how does government discharge its obligations, do the necessary review, and get that done in the time that's required? And I'll just flag one thing that we at King County have been facing with regard to to complying with some of the new mandatory timelines is it's led to much more rigid sort of review and decision making, we're much more careful about making sure that the application is complete when it comes in the door. And I think historically might have been a little bit loose in accepting applications, figuring that the details could kind of get worked out during review. But now that there's strict timelines on processing the applications, we have to be stricter with developers about what we can take in. And then second, previously, I think our view was that if an applicant wanted more time, we were happy to give them more time. It was their project, so if they weren't in a hurry, we weren't in a hurry. If they needed more time to figure out exactly what they wanted to do or work out the details of their project, we'd give them more time. Now the statute precludes us from giving them more time, and it really has to be a yes or no decision with regard to the project much more quicker than it used to be. The Land Use Petition Act is also a product of the mid-90s regulatory reform, and this provides, it's the mechanism by which local permit decisions are appealed to Superior Court. The statute's I think it's sort of a balance. It's very simple. It's a short, simple statute that I think probably you don't have to be an attorney to read and follow, but it has a very short limitations period, 21 days. So the notion is, and I think this, you might hear this theme elsewhere tonight, this is kind of a common theme in Washington planning and permitting, is that there's a robust public process, there's lots of opportunities for challenge, but that once that opportunity expires, then the decision is final and not appealable. So in the context of LUPA, it's very easy to file an appeal, but you only have 21 days to do so, and if you don't file an appeal within 21 days after the permit decision's made, the decision's final and there's no appeal. Another sort of underlying sort of issue or tension with regard to LUPA is its relationship to the Growth Management Hearings Board. So loosely, planning decisions like adopting or amending the comprehensive plan or development regulations are appealable to the Growth Management Hearings Board. Permit decisions are appealable to Superior Court under LUPA. I'll say historically that worked really well because I think there was a really clear sort of demarcation between like the planning decisions and permitting decisions. Now I'm finding that the many comp plan amendments, the broad area-wide rezones are much less common than they were in the past. Now many comp plan decisions are incremental and involve a single site or a small number of sites or a single project, and the structure is still in place, that even those projects have permit-like qualities, because they're sort of project specific, they still go to the Growth Management Hearings Board because they were done as part of the comp plan. And then it sort of works the other way too. Sometimes there are permit decisions that have like a PUD or kind of a planning-like aspect to them, and there are a few cases where the Growth Board has entertained jurisdiction over those cases under a sort of a de facto comp plan amendment theory. So, I mean, I think the point for you, I think I just make is you just need to be sort of intentional when you're making a comp plan decision or a complex permitting decision about what the appeal mechanism might be, because there are pros and people have different views of like going to court or going to the Growth Management Hearings Board. I just say there's pros and cons, reasonable views on both sides, but something that you'd want to be, I think, be intentional about. So I'll just say a bit about a couple of constitutional principles or broader legal principles that apply on top of the statute. Procedural due process is both a federal constitutional and a state constitutional concept, and really the notion is that the decision making has to be fair. Part of fairness is giving notice to providing notice or an opportunity to people to find out about potential decision making so they can participate in the process, and then having a transparent and neutral process for decision making. Substantive due process is focused, as the name suggests, on the substance of the decision, and it incorporates a similar notion of fairness, and that's does the local government regulation, is it a legitimate sort of like area of governmental regulation? Was the decision thought through? Are the regulations designed to address the stated concern? It's a little bit loose and a little bit nebulous, but that's sort of the spirit of substantive due process. Then takings, the other major federal and state constitutional limitation. There are a few ways to have a takings claim, kind of fall into two categories. One is physical appropriation of property. I mean, this is really, for the most part, is more in theory than practice, because I think we all know if we need private property for some public purpose, we'd either negotiate a deal and buy it, or we'd condemn it. But sometimes you get appropriation cases, like if we did a road project and there was the theory was water diversion, so that the water was diverted from a natural course and flooded somebody's property. That's sort of a physical invasion that they claim you could get. But the bigger takings category is the regulatory takings, and this is a notion where it's not an intentional appropriation of somebody's property, but that the rules are in some way so impactful to the property owner that it affects the taking. And I'll say that rules have to be pretty impactful to constitute a constitutional taking. And there's kind of two scenarios. One, if the rules are so strict that they make the property just unusable for any valuable use, so significant diminution in value is not a taking. But if we've had a couple of cases where there was land that was zoned ag land, and the theory was it might have made sense to zone it as ag land 50 years ago, but that now it was just simply unfarmable and not usable. So we've had a couple of those takings cases. But the complete diminution in value that's also uncommon. The much more common theory is either sort of a regulatory taking where the impact on the property owner far outweighed the governmental purpose in the regulation, or in the exaction and dedication context where you're putting conditions on development, that the conditions on development sort of were too far afield from the impacts caused by the project. And the legal lingo there is nexus and rough proportionality. Is the notion of nexus is the condition solving some impact or is the condition addressing some impact of the project, and then separately is the burden sort of roughly proportional to the harm that's being solved. RCW 8202 is sort of a companion to the federal nexus. The federal nexus and rough proportionality rule says that we can charge regulatory fees, and then that you can charge impact fees and put conditions on development if they're addressing an impact of the development. I think vesting is my last slide, and I'm almost out of time, but I'll say, so the notion of vesting is that your project is reviewed under the rules that are in place when the application comes in the door, even if the rules change. I'll say that this is something that you might be mindful about now, because vesting issues are most likely to arise when there are significant changes in the law. So if you adopt new critical area regulations that are much stricter than the old regulations, property owners have an incentive to try to get the benefit of the old regulations. And the rule is what it is. I think my practice point there was that the permitting department just needs to sort of have a plan for that. Know that they're going to be getting lots of vesting questions, and kind of think through in advance how they're going to approach them when you're rolling out a new significant regulatory scheme. Moratoria and interim controls, another GMA concept, and the notion is that sometimes it's coupled with vesting. The notion is that you don't want to have when you're about to change rules, you don't want to have a bunch of people race in the door and try to vest their projects when the new rules are about to go in place. So in some circumstances, you might adopt a moratorium and say, like, okay, we're going to take a comprehensive look. So I don't know, like we did it with regard to like pot marijuana stores. Marijuana had been legalized. Our code hadn't caught up. We didn't want a bunch of people rushing in and saying that they were drugstores under the old code. We wanted to have our own code. So we just rolled out a moratorium and says, like, okay, no new marijuana retail until we figure out what our rules are going to be. And it's not limited. You could do it for mobile home park conversions. You could do it for all sorts of things, but it's essentially a tool to press pause while you figure out what the going forward rules are, so you don't have a bunch of old vested projects. And the last slide just brings us back around to where we started. The land use, I think, is super interesting and super important, but it's complex and it's ever changing and it's a lot of work. But I think that it's an area where the time is well spent, and putting work in on the front end just leads to better acceptance and a better result in the end. Thank you.
Just switching to PowerPoint real quick. We get really fast at this by the end of this.
All right, thanks, Andrew. I like Darren's complex and ever-changing, so I think I will continue that theme as we talk about comprehensive planning under the Growth Management Act. So kind of starting at a high level, why do we really plan? We really want to look at how we involve the public. Darren mentioned that make clear, consistent, transparent decisions. So whether it's a comprehensive plan or a water plan, transportation plan, it's really about thinking what's that roadmap for the future that we want? How do we want our communities to grow and change and accept new neighbors? Looking at those things. So some of the key reasons on the slide you see around planning is, these land use decisions, they take a while to take effect and they have long-term effects. We really need to work together across groups and different ideas of how the community may grow. Accomplishing some of these goals, also requires persistent effort and takes time. And a big one I think we all see is that infrastructure, having the water, sewer, sidewalks, transportation, all of those pieces that support growth and change and comprehensive planning takes a lot of lead time, a lot of payback time. And we really want to see how we can bring the public in and make sure it's a fair and transparent process so they know what to expect when we're developing these plans with lots of input. So when you have development regulations or a permit coming through the door, it's pretty clear what is allowed and how that might move forward, and all members of the community have a chance to understand that and see how it works. And I always like to think of just kind of these values in tension as why do we plan? You have a landowner or a developer or someone who wants to build an accessory dwelling unit. They need to know, they're going to the bank, getting loans, different things. What can I do? When can I get my permit? How long is it going to take? What is expected of me? Then you also have neighbors or community members who want to know what's possible in the community. How is it going to affect my home or my business, or how my community grows and changes? And so really looking at these values and trying to come up with a way that makes it transparent and also provides certainty for the community and the property owners. And so the GMA really tries to do that with creating a framework for public decision-making processes around predictability in the planning realm to really navigate this complex and ever-changing environment that Darren mentioned, and how we can make sure that then the development that follows the comp plan is consistent with those decisions that you made on the comprehensive plan when that development comes in the ground. So really those values in tension that we work through comprehensive planning to address so we can move forward with the projects in a more predictable way. And the last piece on this is just really how you involve the community-wide too, both property owners, neighbors, others, of how they want to see, so we can get that certainty and understanding. Darren touched on this a little, but there is a larger framework around planning in Washington, of which the Growth Management Act is part of, and you see some of these different things from constitutional requirements and other planning laws and the Growth Management Act, and some of these up here that we just talked about. So really it's an ecosystem of rules and frameworks, but the Growth Management Act is probably the most well-known one and is really a roadmap that kind of sets that community vision as you move forward. And we also talked about when Darren was talking to you, but yeah, local planning is really where kind of the rubber meets the road and where you see those impacts, and traditionally that's been where many of these decisions are made. So really important, and most people hold it really close to see how their communities grow and change. Okay. And so the Growth Management Act was passed in 1990, and that was a period of strong growth around the region, especially in the Puget Sound. Saw a lot of farmland conversion, a lot of forest land conversion, traffic issues, and really the quality of life, I think, is the overarching component that people saw was threatened in Washington State. And so the legislature worked on the Growth Management Act to really try to address that in a comprehensive way. And so they stated in 1990, when they adopted this, the legislature finds that uncoordinated and unplanned growth, together with a lack of common goals, pose a threat to the environment, sustainable economic development, and the health, safety, and high quality of life enjoyed by residents of this state. It is in the public interest that citizens, communities, local governments, and the private sector cooperate and coordinate with one another in comprehensive land use planning. And so in order to do that, they have created multiple statutes but governed by these 15 goals you see on the screen, with the most recent one being the climate change goal, in that right-hand column, which was adopted in 2023. And so the goals exist kind of again once in that tension. They're not priority goals, they're not listed in order, any specific order, but a holistic way that communities should look at how you both preserve the environment and accommodate housing, encourage economic development. And a key thing when you're reading through these goals is to really look at some of those, some of the words they use, whether it's encourage, protect. So there's stronger and softer language on different goals, but through the RCWs and the statutes, you really need to develop comprehensive plans that touches on all of these and works to incorporate those. And all of the Growth Management Act references in terms of the revised Code of Washington are all at 3670A, which is a good starting point if you want to do any deeper dives. And so Darren touched on this a little about the Growth Management Act really starting with natural resources. And so when we look back to 1990, and that loss of forest land and farmland that I mentioned and sprawling development, one of the first things with the Growth Management Act was really how do we protect and designate natural resource lands of long-term commercial significance. And so a lot of that work has been done. There's still some tweaks, obviously, and a lot of that occurs at the county level, but how we protect agricultural lands, forest lands, and mineral resource lands. I mentioned the county level, just that a lot of these lands now are outside our cities, they're urban growth areas. So many of these resources are outside of those. And then the other key area within the jurisdictions is the critical areas ordinance. And so how we designate and protect environmentally critical areas, which is usually the final part of a jurisdiction's comprehensive plan, because you get 12 extra months to wrap those up. But that looks at frequently flooded areas, geologically hazardous areas, critical aquifer recharge areas, fish and wildlife habitat conservation areas, and wetlands. And so different steps on how we mitigate those and use best available science to protect those lands and to protect community members from things like geologically hazardous areas, and maintain that natural environment that we saw in the goals. And so best available science is something you'll hear come up a lot during that, and both the state provides some through ecology, our partners there at WDFW as well. And then really the overarching wax in the RCW is really, is it a scientific process, peer-reviewed, using data to look at those. And so you can deviate from best available science that may be provided, but you need to outline why those deviations make sense and how they are acceptable, and meet that science, or meet science and how you're going to monitor that. And so after the kind of protecting those natural resource lands, look across the state and across kind of a transect of lands. And so the Growth Management Act was designed to be not a one-size-fits-all statute. So you can see in this map, everything from kind of the Puget Sound going out, river corridors to Monroe and other King County cities. You see the urban growth areas, and that's really where we want to focus growth. New housing growth, new development growth, that's where we can most effectively and efficiently provide transportation, services, the infrastructure of sewer and water, parks and rec, those type of things that make our communities thrive. And then rural areas, much more limited growth and development around there to kind of protect that rural character. And then the resource lands, which I mentioned in the last slide, so ag lands, forestry lands, and mineral resource lands. And there is that note at the map that critical areas can span all of those different areas. So you'll see critical areas in your urban areas and around stream corridors and forestry areas and such. And so an attempt to kind of make it span across the state and have different requirements in terms of urban service levels and rural levels. that protect the character of each of those environments. And continuing on that theme of not one size fits all, there is regional variation across the state as well. So Monroe is part of the Metro Puget Sound region. You have the Puget Sound Regional Council, which works in Snohomish, King, Pierce, and Kitsap counties, has multi-county planning policies. And then, of course, County of Snohomish has countywide planning policies. And then you have your citywide policies, but you can see kind of down the left, Puget Sound has the most requirements. It's one of the most urbanized areas of the state, and some of the densest levels of development. So more standards to really cooperate on transportation and economic development and urban growth. As you get to different areas of the state, you see some different requirements. Most do plan. Most are fully planning communities, but there are a few counties that do not fully plan under the Growth Management Act. And you see those as partially planning in the orange, so more in the central and eastern part of the state. So this is a newer slide we've developed, but really to try to capture that these are kind of a nested series of decisions, and I also like to think of them as kind of consistent in a hierarchy. So starting at the bottom, if you have, actually off the screen, but since you have multi-county planning policies through Puget Sound Regional Council, as you move up, all of these need to be consistent across the scales. So multi-county planning policies, may deal with large transportation issues, but as we get to local project review or your capital facilities within the city of Monroe, how those are consistent across the Monroe Plan, the Snohomish County, and the Puget Sound Regional Council. So really making sure that you have this consistent hierarchy of following those plans and goals as you move down in the process. And so really thinking those regional coordination around kind of core goals, like I mentioned, traffic, economic development, how we handle population growth, housing choices. And so of those nested decisions, countywide planning policies come from the county in consultation and in collaboration with the cities, but using regional frameworks to plan for future growth, look at designations around urban growth areas and work on expansions of urban growth areas, countywide economic development. Also look at essential facilities, so things like roads, transit hubs, prisons, the word is escaping me, but like waste management facilities, those type of things that need to be cited, more regional on those. And so county and city works together to address those on designating urban growth across those areas. And then within those larger multi-county planning policies, there's large cities and core cities and different typologies that help to address that growth, so it makes sense across the myriad of communities. So to get away from that one size fits all. And so a big piece of that is allocating growth targets. And so these come from population projections at the county level from the Office of Financial Management. And I think we get some of those, some of our population targets tomorrow. OFM usually puts them out April 1st, so they should be coming shortly. But those help develop countywide housing needs and population projections, and then job projections, and then the counties and cities work to see where those can be accommodated, both on urban growth areas, city goals, infrastructure goals. And the goal is to accommodate most of that growth within our urban areas. I think Snohomish County looks to accommodate about 97% of the growth within the urban growth areas, and then 3% is out in the rural areas, which I think when I looked at my numbers was about 10,000 people in Snohomish County, but really trying to keep those rural areas more rural character, low density, supporting ag, forestry, and then have certain areas called landmarks that are local areas of more intensive rural development that can accommodate some of that growth. And then we also have buildable lands, which looks at available parcels, the structures that are on those parcels, and kind of does an inventory and helps cities and counties look at reasonable measures before expanding an urban growth area. So how you look at what sort of capacity you have and what sort of densities you may use to expand, to accommodate those growth target allocations before looking at an urban growth expansion. So here are some of those population numbers, but that's a big reason the Growth Management Act exists, and a lot of the statutes and RCWs that we work through are really how we accommodate a growing state population. And I think we all know from the scenic beauty of a lot of our towns and cities and the job environment and the climate, we continue to attract growth. And so the statewide population as of April 1st last year was 8,115,000, which was about 400,000 additional folks from 2020 to 2025. And so about a 1% growth rate. From 2000 to today, about 5.8 million to 8 million. So really are growing significantly as a state. Yeah, and Snohomish County grew from 827,000 people in 2020 to 873,000 in 2025. It's about 45,000 new residents, or 5.5%. And so much of this comprehensive planning that we undertake and these elements that we'll talk about is really about accommodating this population growth in a well-planned, consistent way. There was some research done at Commerce looking at how this growth affects housing. And so that research that there's a link there that we will share this presentation out, but dives deeper into that, but really saying we need 1 million new homes in the next 20 years that jurisdictions are comprehensively planning for. And so we've had some downturns with the recession of 2009, 2010, where we weren't building as many homes. And so we have fallen behind. And the other big piece I'll talk about a little bit more, Darren mentioned housing was a big part of the Growth Management Act now as it's become more refined and we've protected some of those ag and forest lands. How do we accommodate this new growth? But it's accommodating growth across the income spectrum. So that's what you see on that colored bar running from left to right. So, of those 1 million homes, 350,000 need to be 0-30% and permanent supportive housing. So really kind of staggering numbers, and an equal number, sort of 310,000 at the 120% level and above. But some of the housing work I'll talk about in a moment really looks at how we start to accommodate those across the income spectrums. Still kind of a broad overview of the GMA. Mentioned that the land comes first. We protect those rural and resource lands, and then really identify the urban growth areas, which you see on this map, kind of spattered across the state. And that's really where we want to see existing urban growth go. And as I mentioned, that's where it's most efficient to provide those resources in terms of sewer, water, transportation, housing. So now I'm going to dive in a little deeper to comprehensive plan elements. And elements is basically just the chapters. And I'm guessing many of you, if you've been on the council for a year or so, are familiar with this as you've just gone through your comprehensive plan. But so those different chapters right there that are spelled out, from land use to housing to transportation and climate. And as we look at those elements, it's really doing kind of that due diligence you see on the right side of the slide of what do we have, what's our inventories, what is the conditions of those parks, those roads, those civic facilities, police, fire. And then where do we want to go with that population projection and the community want to be? So what sort of goals and policies? And that's really where we can work in tandem with the communities to understand their desires for a future roadmap. And then working to develop conclusions around how best to accommodate that growth and economic development and community desires. And then coming up with those policies and strategies and commitments that help to guide that forward, so you really have that roadmap that moves it forward and creates a good plan. And so as you work through these elements, that really helps create a strategy and a set of actions to move forward and to develop regulations that help implement your plan. So a couple slides ago, I talked about some of the new housing elements that have been passed in the last few years. House Bill 1220 was signed in 2021. But now cities have to plan for and accommodate housing affordable to all, and so all economic segments of the population in the state, and a variety of residential densities. And so we're starting to see some growth management hearings board decisions on those, of making sure cities really look at how they're planning, not just for the numbers of how many thousand houses you might need or new residents you might have, but the housing that may fit those affordability numbers across that spectrum. So whether that's how affordable is an ADU versus a 4-unit apartment versus larger units, and how we both identify sufficient capacity of land and support middle housing and other laws to accommodate that. And then the other piece of that is you had to go through last year is documenting barriers to housing availability. And those can be gaps in local funding, those can be requirements or developed regulations, and then also looking at racially disparate impacts that may have excluded certain groups and how you may address those through policies and regulations. And so it really expanded that housing goal to take a much more comprehensive, stronger look at how jurisdictions need to address these. And I mentioned 2023 new climate goal was on the books. I guess the good news for Monroe is you have a few years to start to accomplish this. There's been quite a lot of new legislative requirements the last few years that cities have been dealing with and the staff has been dealing with. And so this one for Monroe and Snohomish County is not till 2029. But looking at goals around buildings and energy, transportation and zoning. And there's 2 requirements. One is a greenhouse gas emission reduction requirement, and then a resilience sub-element. So you see some of the minimums on the slide there under the greenhouse gas reduction sub-element. Then under resilience, really looking at hazards and how climate change hazards and how those may affect communities and how you are planning to address those. Whether that's wildfire or flooding or other issues that we've seen the county deal with for sure and our communities deal with recently in these last few years. And Commerce has been working with other state partners to update and release guidance. I think the latest is 2025 on those climate planning, December of 2025 on those climate planning sub-elements. So many resources and tools to help communities and commissions with that work. So now, I had mentioned consistent with multi-county planning policies and countywide planning policies, and then the plan must be internally consistent. So that means your capital facilities element must support those housing goals and those housing numbers you have. Some of that funding and financing must support those parks or transportation needs. And so really looking at how it is coordinated and consistent across the plan internally, so it all makes sense and things don't work against other pieces. And then consistent with neighboring jurisdictions, how you're coordinated, especially on transportation and those type of things. And then the countywide plans, since that has countywide planning policies is CCPs, and then your internal development regulations. And so in more general, kind of stepping back from those comp plan requirements, you know, what really makes a good plan, and as you amend your comprehensive plan and update some of these different system plans as you are moving forward and are thinking about planning moving forward, is, you know, is it realistic? Is it compelling? And is it specific? So realistic, we really want to see plans as we review them and provide technical assistance working with communities. As, you know, is it based on data? Is it based on those projections? Realistic in terms of budgets and future funding opportunities. You know, compelling, how does it meet the goals of the community, both the residents who are here now and future residents and growth, and the business community, the residential community, all of those goals. And that vision, how those goals kind of help address that vision. And then specific, you know, it really should work as a roadmap kind of as you go into your capital improvement plan and investment plans. The comp plan and these development regulations should help you understand what transportation projects need to be funded, what parks need to be funded. So really a roadmap that helps staff and the commissions move some of these things forward that have been talked about in a comprehensive way, and how you move those forward through budgets and future projects that the city or developers may build in your community. And in terms of adoption, you probably went through this about a year ago, but some of the key things I'll just point out in time, and you can read this, but really public outreach, both at the beginning and then through at every stage. And that continues as you continue to amend the plan and adopt development regulations around new policies and new statutes that have come out, but how you can engage that public and have that transparency. Reviews, Darren mentioned SEPA, we have Planning Commission review. Commerce gets a 60-day review that I head up with staff in the cities, and then also work with our state agency partners and housing folks and climate folks at Commerce. And then, of course, the council gets their turn to review and adopt those plans. And then transportation elements also get certified by Puget Sound Regional Council. And then in terms of updates, you can update, for the most part, once a year. You can only amend the comprehensive plan once a year, and that's really so you take a holistic look at that as you move forward. And then update every 10 years. So I think that will be 2034 for Monroe, but there's a 5-year implementation progress report, which will be new for the 24 jurisdictions in 2029. And then Darren had mentioned the Growth Management Hearings Board, so the plans are considered valid when they are adopted, but they can be appealed within that 60 days. And so we have been through the course of 2024 and now into 2025 with some critical areas, seeing a few appeals on different housing laws and some of the critical areas work that's gone forward. So I think all of the jurisdictions plus state agencies have been watching those. Commerce is an advisory body, so we do not regulate. So we look to see how the Growth Management Hearings Board is also interpreting these statutes and adjusting our guidance when sometimes it's different. And then over those 10 years, you know, continually implementing the plans, not just the comprehensive plan, but then those goals and policies and implementation strategies. And so that's really how your budget, your development regulations come together to implement that plan on the ground. And I kind of like that last bullet point on the far right. You know, every project and spending decision should be consistent with that comprehensive plan vision and coordinated. So I think consistent's been our theory of the night. Quickly, development regulations, I've talked about these a few times, but that's really what implements your plans. That's the zoning, the critical areas, public works standards on roads and roundabouts and those type of things, and other design standards. And that's really that takes that policy and goal language and makes it implementable in the different zones within the city, and how those goals will be realized on the ground. This is a new slide we added just because a lot of questions around housing, but really looking at a broad range of housing types. So accessory dwelling units must allow 2 per lot. Darren mentioned subdivision code, so there's different ways of allowing those lots to be separated and sold now in unit lot subdivisions. Middle housing, co-living, different transitional housing, so a lot of new rules, and that's probably, with Andrew and I at Commerce, that's been probably the biggest growth area of Commerce, providing resources for planners, and so I can work with anyone that reaches out to provide those resources if needed around housing. Whoops, what did I do? Sorry.
Oh, wow.
Sounds the intro.
It's, okay, sorry. We switched to the wrong presentation.
I think
Just
we're taking a break.
absently
Yeah,
touched the button and switched to an entire different presentation.
Keep my hands up where can't do any damage.
So we'll just hop
Just
forward.
about that. Almost done.
Do I have to do anything? You'll pause. Okay.
So some of that housing, I mentioned lots of resources on that on the Commerce site, which we should have a link to at the end. Concurrency is another big piece of providing the capital facilities, both when you think of housing, both transportation. Now we're seeing the infrastructure around sewer, water, those type of things that are needed to accommodate growth and level of service, and then also the maintenance to keep up as infrastructure ages and how we finance all of those. That upgrades and maintenance is becoming more challenging for cities as they work to address a lot of the legislative items around housing that have come out recently. You guys just went through this so quickly, in the review and revision, really the goals of the Growth Management Act is that cities need to review and revise, and so you don't have to change everything, but you need to make sure that you're current with all of the laws that have been passed since the last update, need to have that public outreach component, and then need to adopt development regulations that are consistent with the legislative updates and the goals and changes in your comprehensive plan. And so in that review, they mentioned a few of the targets, capital facilities, critical areas, housing targets, and addressing those. Yeah, and then this should come out in a packet, or you'll be able to click on these, but Commerce has a lot of different resources, both from the short course on planning that you see here, that go through all of the different things we are talking about tonight, and do a deep dive through our website that has both for kind of planning staff, commissioners, council members, members of the public, a lot of handbooks and workbooks that folks have put together. There's one more resource slide, but you'll have all those, and I will turn it back to, well, I guess we're taking a break now, I think, for on time.
Do you want me to jump in for a second?
Yeah.
So everybody, we typically have a 10-minute break. We are running 5 minutes behind, which, by the way, as the short course coordinator, I can tell you 5 minutes behind is beautiful. We're doing great. So I just want to mention it. Monroe is willing to bring coffee and some snacks out. So if we want to stay just on time, would a 5-minute break be okay, or do you want 10?
Are there any questions right now for council or commissioners? None?
Okay.
5
so
minutes.
5 minutes?
Yep.
I don't know if we let the folks know online about that. Apologies, everybody. It's normally my role to stand at the back of the room and make sure we stay on time. So I'm used to doing that a lot. So really, really want to say thank you, everybody, for making it here for the short course on local planning. I know you just went through your comp plan process. Understand when the short course was created, it was to really educate folks that were new to the process, which is why it's called the short course, even though it takes 3 hours and we keep you here a long time. The intention is for it to be a short, quick overview of all the things that affect land use within the state. And so it's my pleasure today to bring you the roles and planning part of the portion of the course. Man, all right, I'm gonna have to drink more water. Anyway, so to get started, roles in planning is really about, the short course was designed especially for new planning commissioners. I don't know that we have a lot of new planning commissioners here. Do we have any new planning commissioners here? One? Okay, perfect. So this was literally, I had to look behind me first, I apologize. This was really designed for new planning commissioners. The message is really meant to kind of orient you to this new space you've just found yourself in. And with roles in planning specifically, it's a lot of work to be a planning commissioner. I've known multiple planning commissioners in my lifetime, and I gotta tell you, it was a labor of love for them because they didn't get a lot of thanks. Sometimes they got yelled at a little bit, and they spend innumerable hours working on the short course, working on their role as a planning commissioner for their community. So your goal when you do planning as part of the planning commission, as part of the city council, and working with staff, is to create a factual and accurate record of how you got to where you end up. That factual and accurate record, as Darren was talking about, is really what you want to bring should you ever get challenged on a decision. And it doesn't matter how good you do the job, you're going to get challenged on a decision because people have different opinions about what they want to happen in their community, and this is a process by which they can challenge. So that factual and accurate record showing the planning commission operations up to the council and the decisions that you made is how you're going to get there and how you can defend what you're doing. So to start, we all think about the participants in the planning process. As you can see, it's pretty much everybody. When you include the public, it's pretty much everybody. But the roles in planning presentation, we're really trying to just highlight a couple of those key focus areas that you need to think about as you're doing this. The first and foremost is the legislative ad. So you're elected officials. So you're usually either a mayor-council or council-mayor or commission. So strong mayor versus or there's the mayor that has a city administrator that makes all the executive decisions. Regardless of how you're setting it up, you're the legislative body that is expected to do things like pass the comp plan. You're engaging the community on your long-term vision and goals. You're the ones that are going to basically define where the community is going and approve that plan to move in that direction. You communicate the strategic vision, the policies, the priorities. You're the #1 ear for the community when they're seeking to provide input. And the comprehensive plan mandates public involvement. So you're going to hear a lot of engagement. You probably just did this, but you're the #1 ear for the public to reach out to when you're going through the process. You're also going to decide, you're going to make the plan work. So as Jeff already alluded to, you decide what happens with the budget. That is literally you implementing your plan. You vote to make those changes to code that are going to implement your plan. And then you have the planning commissioners. So the planning commissioners kind of get to do all the work that the council doesn't have time for. Planning, these decisions take a lot of time. A lot of times, I didn't ask this, and maybe somebody can tell me, do you guys use a hearings examiner? Okay, perfect. So you're not quasi-judicial, which means you're not finding yourself having to say no comment and please don't bug me on my shopping trip in the grocery store because I can't talk about it. You're not finding yourselves in those situations. The hearing examiner is covering that for you. Well, what you are finding yourself in is you're the place where the public can get involved early. And that's a huge deal because you can work with them on where they have concerns before it ever comes up to city council. The planning commission is a group of volunteers. You're appointed by the elected body. This is for the whole audience. And it's your job to do an in-depth review of all land use proposals and plans along with managing that public engagement process. You work with the elected body and the planning staff. So you're kind of in between the two. And you're in many ways, you'll see those ideas first when there's maybe a change coming down the pipe for the entire community. And so you get to work through them, you get to research, you get to figure out what's going on. you assist the planning department in carrying out its duties and objectives. One of the things that I don't have in this presentation in half a dozen spots like we used to, but it goes without saying, the biggest request for planning commissioners when you're providing this service is to, one, show up. We know it's volunteer. We know it's a lot of work, but just showing up so that there's quorum and things can move forward, and then reading the information that's provided to you by the staff ahead of time so that you're not caught off guard in the meetings. Can't emphasize those 2 points enough, even though I took it out of the presentation because we literally were reminding you every other slide. That work you put in yields huge dividends for your community. And then you, of course, have the planning staff. And we love the planning staff because they have to do everything. They are in support of the Planning Commission. They are in support of the City Council. They are also the ones who typically are first addressing questions to the community and maybe directing the community to the public engagement process that your city follows. They're the ones that are also going to be responsible for the permit decisions. They're the ones who are going to make it all work at the end. And they're kind of your check-in. What I'm doing, is that allowable within the law? They're that group of individuals that are there to advise you. So land use, building permits, economic development, code enforcement, legislative. I hear code enforcement is a lot of fun when I talk to planners about that, and every planner I know has had to do code enforcement at some point. So participants, so you're a hearings examiner group. So hearings examiners function in your quasi-judicial area. It's where you have to make, and Darren will correct me if I'm a little off here, it's where you have to make actually a binding decision with legal connotations. And some communities still have their planning commission do that. Most have moved to a hearings examiner because it really shields them from a lot of liability when they do that. And the hearings examiner comes in as a impartial judge to come in and talk and just see what your factual record is for what your planning decisions were, and then see if you followed that and address that from an objective standpoint when it comes to a very specific decision. And I always get these mixed up, but conditional use permits, variances, subdivisions, those are examples of things that a hearings examiner would come in and make a decision on. They also ensure due process for hearing testimony. We talked about due process. It's a constitutional requirement. And they apply laws and issue final decisions. So they kind of function in a way that helps shield the council and the commission when it comes to something like that, where there might be, as is going to be discussed, a question about impartiality. So other advisory bodies, it's not just the Planning Commission. Do you have a Parks Board? Okay. Public Works Board? Okay. Every city's different, but you will literally find half a dozen bodies, including your regional transportation organization, that are all planning. And everything they're working on, their goals, their decisions, their visions, all of that has to align back to the comprehensive plan. And you have to consider what those things are when you make your decisions and when you're looking at a proposal. And so it's just important to know that you're coordinating with all of these other organizations. They support the comp plan goals. They provide the focus on key projects, and they communicate with the community because every one of them is going to have their own public process. So they're a feedback mechanism as well. The public, so I actually like this list. I used to participate in this process as a part of a nonprofit, and it was extremely interesting to me to see how interest groups, business community, developers, and residents all apply themselves in the comprehensive planning process. Every one of them has something valuable to bring. One of my favorite examples was there was a public works gentleman working near us, and we were at a public meeting together. And I was there for another reason, for another entity. And he was talking to a community member and he said, no, there's a well there. And the guy's like, oh, there's not a well there. There's nothing on my map. There's never been a well. No, there's a well there. I need you to know there's a well there. And he actually showed him that there was a well there. And through that conversation, they were talking to each other about it at that public meeting. They learned something about an area that changed how they were looking at that entire area. Your community members have long memories, and they remember things that have changed in this community, especially as we grow. And so they represent that body of knowledge to you, and they can tell you things you maybe didn't know. And that's always a value. The media is also something I like to focus on. When you're looking at needing to get broad word out about a comp plan change or something like that, the media is often your best bet to covering more than the usual suspects. You're always going to have folks that are paying attention to what the council does. They see it as their civic duty, and it's amazing. But getting that message out beyond that really comes through the media, and it takes a working relationship. Folks need to be paying attention and making sure that they know, hey, this is a critical council meeting coming up, or this is a critical planning commission meeting coming up. And they can help you elevate that to the broader community and share what you're doing. Developers are a great example for, hey, we're about to pass a code. And the developer says, well, if you do that, that's going to make it really hard for me to push these 2 or 3 projects through that we're just about ready to submit applications on. Per Darren's earlier testimony, vesting laws in Washington are really strong. Once the application's in, they're vested. But at the same moment, you have development stuff that's taking years to put together, and you're about to change the rules. You want to talk to the development community. They might tell you if it's going to cause hiccups on something you were expecting. Anyway, the public is probably your most important resource. And then there's the state agencies. As Jeff said, we're not actually regulatory at Commerce, but you're required to submit your comp plan to us so we can review it. When we review it, we're not the only ones reviewing it. All the state agencies are reviewing it. They all review it through our system. And so state agencies are also the ones that are creating that best available science, so you don't actually have to hire a scientist to do it, so that you can meet that best available science standard for critical areas ordinances. I have a master's degree. I focused my entire research process on the State Environmental Policy Act. And one of the things I did when I was doing that, if you don't mind me a tangent for a moment, was I was interviewing responsible officials for the State Environmental Policy Act as a part of my research. And I'm talking to them, and I had one of them tell me, well, we don't need that as much anymore. SEPA's great, but we rely now on the GMA and critical areas ordinances. You are enacting environmental protection at a local level that is, it's kind of the de facto environmental protection for our state if you're not covering like a clean water permit from the federal government or clean air or something like that. So critical areas are critical, and they happen here at the local level. State agencies are reviewing those, and they're trying their best. They will come out. You ask any one of them, and you can have a state agency out here to present on a specific issue anytime you want for critical areas, because they want to get that information out to your communities. Land use decision types. So this is an interesting one. It used to be actually in a different format, and I had our design marketing person change it. So I'm going to try to speak to it, but I'm used to speaking to it from a different way. So we want folks to understand that the council's there to do legislative decision making. The Planning Commission is there to give advice for the legislative decision making. If you're not acting in a quasi-judicial way, you are there to give advice to the City Council on a legislative decision making. And going back to that point that both Darren and Jeff made, the GMA focuses on huge public involvement when it comes to the planning process. It's absolutely a mandated process. But the second your plan is adopted and there's no challenges, it's all about efficiency, 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 get the permits out the door. And that's, as Jeff mentioned, what we're seeing specifically with housing. It's one of the reasons they modified the Local Project Review Act. So all of these things are changing, but the fundamentals are the same. Your public engagement takes place during the GMA comp plan update or your amendment, or whatever outreach you're doing throughout the year. And then that allows permits to move forward in an effective and quick manner. So it's the staff's job to implement those permits, and it's the hearings examiner's job to deal with those slightly more complex, larger issues, like the discretionary permits that you release. Land use planning decisions, administrative, I just covered this. I guess I got to divide it into 2 slides next time. But you really want to think about, these are examples of what decisions you're expected to deal with, whether you're the planning commission, the hearings examiner, or the city council. Participation for individuals. So this is an interesting one. My primary background is in public engagement. And when you're dealing with public engagement, educating the public on what decision you're making and what impact they can have is the most effective way to helping them understand how they can engage. Because you don't want somebody to come in and say, I don't know what to do here. You guys have already made the decision. Well, maybe the county planning process dictated that you have to have this transportation corridor in this area because it was a part of your regional coordination and you already know that's happening. And you can say that. You can say, well, this is how this is working. But right now we're trying to decide on some buffers, or we're dealing with some issue regarding a developer, and that is something that they can have input on right then and there. Grounding your community members in where they're at in the process and helping them to actively provide feedback to you is critical to it being an effective process. And so just mentioning that, there's a lot of education, it's a lot of conversations as you're working with folks. And then you need to be able to do this in an effective manner, which means you need to manage your meetings well. Every city does it different. Everybody I've talked to does it slightly different. It's all maybe a little Robert's Rules adjacent, but every city has a process where they help the community understand how they can most effectively engage. And so whether it's how you group pros and cons at a meeting, the time limits you set. I watched you at the beginning of this meeting. You had a very clear process for public engagement. You started the meeting with it. Having all of that lined up so that folks know how to engage and can feel effective at it is hugely critical to your success. Beyond that, your own interactions in the meetings, how you treat each other, having the chair set guidelines and rules for how folks are supposed to conduct themselves in the meeting. That's all critical, whether it's a planning commission meeting or a city council meeting. For most of you look like you've done this a few times. I'm sure you've had the meetings where there was 5 people in the room, the same 5 people. I'm also sure you've had the meetings where there were 45 people in the room, or there were 500 people in the room, and you went for 5 hours in that meeting because everybody got their 3 minutes in public comment. I see it all the time with my jurisdiction, and it's all issue dependent. But at the end of the day, setting up those standards ahead of time is what's going to allow you to deal with both the 5-hour meeting and the 15-minute meeting, depending on what's on your agenda. I will mention one thing as we get to the questions slide. I'm the short course coordinator. My job is actually to coordinate the volunteers. We had the original presenter who was going to present this portion tonight, had to cancel due to an emergency. And so normally you get a planning director in here or a volunteer planner, and they do an amazing job, way better than I can do. But I will tell you that there's 2 different things that they always mention. One of them is, and it's a recommendation, not from Commerce, but from one of our primary presenters, they always recommend that you maybe have 1 to 2 meetings a year between a city council and a planning commission. And the whole point of that is so that you kind of know what you're both working on and you see it coming. You're going to have times when the council won't maybe agree with the commission's recommendation. That's going to happen. The council is the most direct avenue to the public. And they may say, hey, no, sorry, as much as we know how much work you put into this, we feel we have to go another direction. Taking the time in like those meetings to explain why you're doing that is, or why you had to do that in a given circumstance, really helps with the communication between those 2 bodies. Having what the workload is, so you know what the priorities are when you start the year, can really help you to get through that process. The other thing I was going to bring up that I'm suddenly forgetting was it had to do with staff. So planning staff, their job is to advise you. Their job is to tell you what the law says. Their job is to research. They're also, whether they agree with it or not, expected to move the Planning Commission's recommendation forward to the council. And if you're going to find your times, just because of the way this works, you're going to find yourself at times maybe frustrated at the planning staff. No, we decided we want to do it this way. And they're going to follow that process, and they're expected to. But at the end of the day, if you're really frustrated with them, maybe talk to them on the side instead of in a public meeting. You're going to have disagreements with each other. You address your concerns to the public, not to each other in a meeting. It's really all about how nice we play with each other in the sandbox, knowing we have different opinions and different viewpoints. Planning commissions are brought into the process because the council values those viewpoints, and they expect you to bring them. You just might not have that viewpoint be the primary focus when a decision is made. Anyway, that's all I've got for the roles, and I'm going to hand this over to Darren, and I think I stayed on time. So. Is there any questions?
Councilmember Beaumont.
Thank you, Mayor. I'm not sure who to direct this to out of the three of you, but I did have a question. I was looking at the periodic update map for the comp plan, and I see that some counties are partial planning is required, and I'm just wondering, is that due to population differences in the state?
It's a little more complicated than that. Do you want to actually?
I'm just curious what that means. Thank you.
Yeah, population and growth rate mainly. So
I'm going to add to that a little bit. So when the GMA came out in the 1990s, counties had to opt in. And if you were over a certain population, I think you were automatically required to do forward planning. But if you were under it, you had to choose whether to opt in on that. And so many counties chose to opt in. And so those ones that chose to opt in are still required to fully plan under the Growth Management Act. However, you've got a few, I think it's 11. I think it's 11, partially planning counties where they didn't opt into the process. They are still a part of the GMA. The only difference is they're not required to comprehensively plan. Instead, they're just required to do natural resources in critical areas. There are some other things. There's nuances to that, and I'm not an expert enough to explain that. But generally speaking, they are still required to do all those environmental protections and that natural resource designation stuff. They just aren't required a comprehensive plan. There's also several of those communities that do comprehensive plan. They just don't do it under the GMA. They've just chosen that as a method for actually how they want to put their stuff together. And that's allowed. Yeah. But it is, okay. Thank you. It's only now you're in. So the process for removing yourself from that is maybe a little complicated. Maybe Darren can talk about that. But generally speaking, yeah, you're in, and most communities went that direction. What you will find for regional variation with planning under the GMA is a lot of the core requirements. You noticed it with the climate slides that Jeff was sharing with you. If you have a certain population, you're expected to do this. If you're in a really populated community area, like the Puget Sound, you're expected to do this. But if you get out to a rural part of eastern Washington, they're not expected to do this. And you'll notice that consistently with the legislature. They will come in and they will say, hey, we're going to make this requirement, but we're not going to make the smaller, more rural communities do it. We're just going to make the populated areas do it. And then you add in the Puget Sound Regional Council, and there's just a lot of things going on there. You have the most fun of everybody in the process. So real quick, I'm going to put up the next presentation for Darren.
Any other questions?
Yes.
Commission or council?
I love that you can hear me tap my mouse when I
heard that. Tap, tap, tap.
It's a really good mic. Yeah.
Super. Well, I'm gonna do the last segment, and I'm gonna cover some open government laws, the Open Public Meetings Act, the Public Records Act, and a little bit on the appearance of fairness doctrine. So at its most basic, the Open Public Meetings Act, or OPMA, requires that meetings of a governing body like this one are open to the public. I guess I should say to start, the OPMA is really important to the legislature and to the legislative process. In 2014, the state adopted a law that requires that local elected officials have an OPMA training on a certain schedule. The summary I'm going to give today satisfies that state training requirement. The overview is that the OPMA requires that meetings of a governing body of a public agency are open to the public, and that people are permitted to attend and to participate, subject to some requirements. There's significant consequences to not following the Open Public Meetings Act. If there's a action taken, a vote, for example, in a meeting that doesn't comply, then the action could be null and void. The members of the body could be subject to a financial penalty. Somebody brings a lawsuit, they could get attorney's fees. And although I didn't write this one down, the most important thing to some people is that violating the Open Public Meetings Act is a basis for a recall petition. So important to pay attention to these sort of particular rules. So there's a few sort of general concepts that sort of define the scope of the OPMA. First is what's a meeting? Meeting is in a sense intuitive, a gathering like this, but it's also nuanced, and there are some things that might not be intuitive that it could also constitute a meeting. So a meeting is a situation where there's a quorum of the body. So it looks like this is a 7-member council, and so 4 would be a quorum. Imagine you are a 3-member commissioner county where 2 would be a quorum. Very difficult to manage that. Managing for a 9 or 7-member body or 5-member body is much easier. But a quorum plus action, and I'll say an action is both a defined term and broader than you might think. One way to understand the breadth of what constitutes action for OPMA purposes is to contrast action with final action. So final action is like a vote, a collective positive or negative decision by a majority. In contrast to final action that's like a vote, action is really any sort of business of the body. So receiving testimony, deliberating, discussing issues, doing reviews, evaluations, all of those things are actions that if done by a quorum would give rise to a meeting. OPMA applies to public agencies. So public agencies also broadly defined: state agencies, counties, cities, school districts, sub-agencies like planning commissions and civil service commissions. All of those are potentially agencies covered by the OPMA. The OPMA applies to governing bodies. So this is an important concept because governing bodies are multi-member bodies. So in a jurisdiction with an executive branch, the mayor or the county executive, not subject to the OPMA. So they can have private meetings, they can meet with a group of people, they can, in figuring out their executive agenda or executive decision making, no OPMA requirement. It only applies to essentially to legislative bodies, to multi-member bodies. Examples of likely meetings. So I say this is obviously a meeting that's I think sort of self-describing, but many other things can constitute a meeting if done by a quorum. So an email conversation, if one member sends email communication to the other members and then there's a response and sort of a conversation by email, that could be a meeting. Serial emails or phone calls or texts could be a meeting. So the scenario here, again, this is a bigger issue with a 3-member body, but member 1 calls member 2 and they talk about, well, if it's a 3-member body, that would be a meeting. But say a 5-member body, one member calls another member, so there's 2 talking, so that's not a meeting because it's not a quorum, and they talk about an issue and maybe make a plan about what they're going to do, and then one of those members calls the third member and says like, hey, I was just talking to member 2, and here's what we're working on, what do you think? And then maybe then one of those people calls member 4. So each of these are two-person conversations, but because they're happening in a serial nature, either by phone call or by text, you can have a meeting. And there are some cases on this where jurisdictions have it's become clear. City of Seattle had one. The University of Washington Board of Regents had one. It became clear that essentially these things were worked out in advance, and then they did the public records request. They got the documents. It became clear what had happened, and it was a problem. A gathering involving a quorum, like to hear the state of the city or state of the county presentations, you're receiving information, that'd be action. If a quorum's there, it could be a meeting. This doesn't mean you can't do this, it just means you would need to sort of notice it like a meeting, and we'll get to the notice requirements in a minute. Or a quorum that had a dinner party, if it was a quorum of members and they're doing the business of government and talking about things. All of those are potentially meetings. And I think that often the way that either the press, or this is one of those situations where there's a potential of a lawsuit, that would be bad. Even if there's not a lawsuit, there's a potential of media attention and press. That's often bad. And the University of Washington had a case where they were picking the next president, and that was going to be a decision of the regents, so subject to the OPMA, and they held the meeting and they did the deliberations and they took a vote. Everything seemed to be on track. And then they sort of like retired to the side room where the cake was sort of already available. It said, congratulations, and then named the new president. And somebody saw that cake and they thought like, so either, somebody was either prescient or the board had kind of figured out what they were going to do in advance. And then there were public records requests and it didn't go super well. I don't think there was a lawsuit about that, but it was extremely embarrassing to the body. So something to be sensitive to. There are things that are not a meeting. So one is the passive receipt of information. So the common scenario is one member gets some information, gets that's relevant to the decision making, and they send that to all the other members and said, hey, you should read this in advance because I'm going to make some points about it at the meeting. The one-way communication is not a meeting, so that's okay. The risk is that another member will respond, and then somebody will respond to that, and then you have a conversation, and then you have a meeting. One way to sort of guard against that happening is to, and I don't want to say around that because you're not like circumventing anything, this is fully consistent with the rule. One way to address that is if one member has information to share with the other members, they have the clerk share it so that the response would go to the clerk, not a meeting. The response wouldn't go to the other meetings, and it's sort of guard against a conversation. So for meetings, I think I alluded to this, that this problem is always solvable by noticing, so you have a state of the county address or have some gathering where there's the quorum of the council there and they're doing something about the business of government. One way to address it is to advertise it as a meeting, and there's kind of two ways that you have meetings. One is the regular meeting, so this is usually established by code or by the charter, or it's formally established, and that the body meets at a certain day of the second Tuesday of the month at 7 p.m. at a location, for example. And there's some minimal notice requirements for that meeting, but there's sort of a presumption that that meeting is going to occur, and if you want to follow the business of government, you go to the meeting. And I suppose the important point about that meeting is anything's on the table. There's an agenda requirement, but the body is not limited to what's on the agenda. You can add things to the agenda at the meeting. You can conduct an executive session, even if it wasn't noticed. The premise is that people who want to follow government are following the meeting. So those are regular meetings. Then there are special meetings. So and special meeting is a term of art. So these are meetings other than the meetings that occur in the ordinary course. They're called by the presiding officer or by the majority of the members if the presiding officer doesn't agree. The very particular notice requirements about what the notice has to include, when it has to be issued, and who has to get it. And then, let's back up. I think the key point is that the special meeting the content of the meeting is limited to what's on the agenda. So if you advertise a special meeting to address a particular issue, you're limited to addressing that issue at the meeting. So that's a limitation. Sometimes legislative bodies find special meetings to be an opportunity. If you're worried, if the will of the body is to cabin in the discussion in a meeting to one topic, you're going to want to make sure that it doesn't get distracted or you get into other things and you focus on one thing. If the risk of doing that at a regular meeting is you don't have a tool to cabin it in because any member can sort of bring up any issue. But you could replace a regular meeting with a special meeting, and maybe just to keep things straight, start it a little bit earlier or a little bit later than regular. But you could turn a regular what would otherwise be a regular meeting into a special meeting, and then that would have the effect of limiting the discussion to the topics that was on the agenda. So it's sort of a limitation, but depending on the will of the body, sometimes that's an opportunity. There's particular rules about, or particular exceptions about meetings during emergencies. As you might imagine, these are post-COVID rules. When COVID came along, there was sort of historic and not super well developed systems for holding emergency meetings, but of course, the whole COVID hadn't really been anticipated. Now we've sort of been through the COVID drill. The OPMA has been updated, and there are very particular rules for how something like that should be addressed again. And let's hope we don't get to those. There are particular rules about public comment during meetings, and the slides focus on the OPMA requirements with regard to public comment. As I was thinking about this on the way up here, I realized that I should also say that there's also an underlying constitutional sort of First Amendment protection that individuals have some constitutional rights to speak, subject to some limitations. But generally, agencies, they have to give notice of matters that they're taking up. This is an OPMA requirement. In the land use context, I think we talked about this earlier, there's a whole host of other rules about early and continuous public participation and having avenues for the public to contribute, and all of those GMA and other land use rules would apply on top of the OPMA. But for OPMA purposes, agencies have to give an opportunity for public comment. In most circumstances, the opportunity could be for written comment or oral comment, although there is a requirement that there be an opportunity for public testimony at some point before final action is taken, either at that meeting or at a prior meeting. There's no obligation to connect the public comment to the action taken, no obligation to respond to the public comment or offer any explanation. Really the obligation is to sit and let the people talk, consider it in whatever manner the body thinks is appropriate, and move on. And I'll say, it might be that the considering and addressing the public comments, considering the public comments might inform comments that individuals make as part of the debate, and if that's how it goes, all the better. But my observation, my sense is that getting in a back and forth with an individual who's testifying is futile. It's just futile. I have put a note in about disturbances during meetings. Of course, if there's a safety issue or a criminal issue, all of that can be addressed. I'll say there's I don't know if you all experience that, but I'll say, in downtown Seattle, that at every meeting, there are people who come to our meetings and they come to create a disturbance, and they take every opportunity to testify that they can, and they say just incredibly vile things. And we, like you, we have rules that we read at the start, and we try to enforce the rules. I think there's a couple points. One is that the key thing is consistency. I think and it's really hard to be consistent because so we'll have a rule that limits testimony to 3 minutes. Someone will be testifying, they'll be super constructive, they'll be thoughtful, we'll want to know what they say, we'll be writing down what they say because they have really good ideas. It's tempting to let them go a little bit long because their testimony is so helpful. Then somebody else comes up, their testimony is vile. Their position is they're entitled to equal treatment. And it's tragic, but that's really the state of the law. So my sense is the best thing to do, there's two key points. The best thing to do is, to the degree that you can, have clear and consistent rules. And I think putting as much structure around it as possible, and it's clear that you have a place you sit, the public has a place they sit. The public doesn't go up on the dais. And that rule applies to everybody. And that there's a sign-in system, and that they speak in order, and that they stay seated, and that there's a limit on signs, and anything that just sort of puts like structure around the meeting, I think helps control disturbances. And then, but I will acknowledge that is not a complete answer, and that with regard to the vile testimony, our sense is that often you just have to let the people talk. It's just like 3 minutes of your life that you're not going to get back, and but you just have to cede that 3 minutes, let them talk. Their 3 minutes is up, they're done. You don't say a word and move on. And often that our experience is that's the most practical. That's not a great way. It's not a super satisfying resolution, but that's the most practical way to deal with it. So executive sessions involve situations where the public can be excluded from the meeting. There's very particular rules about this. They involve, I mean, it's sort of self-proving the scenarios they involve. There's situations where the public release of the information would be detrimental. So getting legal advice, deliberating about an employment decision, maybe like the most clearly talking about a situation where the jurisdiction's going to purchase property and the members are talking about what the conversations about what's the bottom line on price. Of course, you can't have a public conversation about the bottom line on price. It's not going to be a very effective negotiation. There's very specific executive session rules. The clerk and your attorney can give you, can help you implement them. And as long as you follow the rules, everything goes fine. So that's the end of my OPMA points. Next is the Public Records Act. So these are rules about keeping and providing public access to documents. And I'm of a generation that I still think of documents as paper. Still are some paper documents, but now much of the action is with regard to electronic documents. And it's very difficult because there's so many electronic documents. What I'll say. So there's some statutory requirements. The agency has to have a public records officer. They have to have procedures for keeping documents, subject to some state retention requirements, and then making records available to the public. There are some, I'd call these best practices because I'll say one of the, and I put this on the previous slide, one of the principles is providing the fullest assistance to requesters. That's one thing the Public Records Act says, that it's our obligation to provide the fullest assistance to requesters. I want to highlight that when I get to the requester slide. So I think most jurisdictions have a system for dealing with requesters. They have a form that we ask requesters to fill out. We have ask for certain information about the records they're looking for. That's sort of a best practice. Most people fill out the form. It works better for everybody if they use the form. We understand their request. We can get them what they want. They get the stuff. But we would not get, if somebody did refuse to fill out the form, that would not be, at least for us, probably preclude us from responding to the request because it feels inconsistent with providing the fullest assistance. But having a plan for dealing with requesters, I think, is sort of like having a plan for dealing with people who show up to testify at the hearing. Everything goes better if you thought through it in advance and you put some structure around it, but sometimes there has to be a little bit of flexibility, and I think because of the spirit of the OPMA, the flexibility has to go to the benefit of the public. Mm-hmm. So if you get a public records request, there's a few things that you can do. Provide the record. I always say that first. If somebody asks for something and we just have it, like they ask for a copy of the org chart or a copy of an ordinance or a copy of it, so we would just give it to them and just be done with it. If it's available on our website, we might tell them where they could find it. The key caveat here is if the information is available from some other agency, it's not sufficient to send the requester off to another agency to get the stuff. We might sometimes tell them, it's like, hey, you probably can get a lot more stuff or more efficiently this other place, but that we still have our obligation to disclose what we have, and if it's on the web, we would tell people that. One is, if the request is in any way complicated, we acknowledge receipt and tell them how long we need to gather the stuff. We do that acknowledgement within 5 days, but the amount of time you need is sort of subject to local discretion, but there's like a reasonableness standard with regard to local discretion. Fourth is if we don't understand the request, to ask for clarification, and then fifth is to deny the request, which is either if we thought if the stuff was exempt, if they asked for like a privileged memo that we had provided to our client, we would just say, we're not going to give it to you. And there's some rules about asserting the exemption. And of course, in other scenarios, we just don't have anything. And you've asked for something that we don't have. And that's that. This slide has some just sort of some practical tips about seeking clarification in a way that sort of ensures that we do our best to respond to the request and satisfy our legal obligation, and not get sort of bogged down in a back and forth with the requester. This slide has some practice pointers about searching, because also one way that things go sideways is we get a public records request, we do our best, we disclose stuff, we think we're done, and then later it turns out we had some stuff we didn't disclose, that we didn't find it for one reason or another. At that point, the question is going to turn to, if we get sued, the question is going to turn to how hard did we look? And so this has practice pointers of both about how to do the search and how to document the search. And one additional point I'd make that's not on this slide is I think that the one doing the search is critical, and this kind of comes back to making a thoughtful choice about who the public records officer is. I'll say my experience is responding to public records request is not a job people volunteer to do. So at the agency, there's not people clamoring for being the one to respond to the requests. Sometimes it trickles down to a newer person is doing the collecting, and it might be that there's a role for the newer person to help. But my experience has been it's really critical that the one who's kind of managing the response to the request has to be familiar with the agency. That for us, often with the department director's confidential, their admin, their confidential staff person would be an example of somebody who could do it for two reasons, do a good job for two reasons. One is they understand the agency, they know where to look, they know what employees you can sort of rely on and which employees you have to check with twice about. And then second, they speak with the authority of the director. So when that email comes from them that says, so that the director's admin sends out an email and says, okay, I need all your documents within 2 weeks, they're likely to read that email because it comes from their boss's office, and they're likely to respond. So having someone with some authority being managing the request, I think, is often best for all involved. Here's some slides. So there's some exemptions. There's a whole laundry list of statutory, sort of like executive sessions. And there's some scenarios where you can go into executive session. There's a whole laundry list of reasons that the government cannot disclose, can withhold information. This slide has some points about exemptions. They're narrowly construed. There's some procedural requirements you have to go through if you're going to assert them. This slide is sort of on an idiosyncratic issue, and that's electronic records that are on private devices and accounts. So this is with volunteer and even elected officials. They have their own life, and there's no wage and hour rules. They work kind of around the clock, and when they're in the grocery store and on the weekend and when they're at home, in addition to when they're in the office. So things come in on their personal cell phone or they come into their personal email. And of course, we'd suggest doing everything you can to get things onto the public devices is the best you can do. And of course, there's things you don't control. Members of the public might know, if they know your personal email, they might send you an email. Getting that stuff onto the government system, I think, is the best practice. But there are some cases, they establish that just because if there's a document that would otherwise be a government document, the fact that it's on your personal computer doesn't make it's not a public document. So you should be mindful of that. But the cases also recognize that members have a personal life, and they could have a personal Facebook page, and there's guidance for how to plan in advance to protect the personal nature of your stuff. This slide sort of covers sort of best things to do to try to avoid problems there. There are penalties for violating the Public Records Act. The financial penalties run on a per-day basis, so they can add up very quickly. And there's attorney's fees available too. Courts have lots of discretion about the range of penalties and fees to impose. This is one of the reasons why documenting all of our reasonable efforts to fully understand what the request was, to look hard to find the information, to engage with the applicant, are a way to, their mistakes are going to be made, and they're a way to sort of limit the financial exposure. There's a bunch of very particular rules about records retention. It's driven by some schedules that are established by the state. This slide just has some, you should rely on professional staff to help you follow these rules. This slide has some of the details about mostly about the Secretary of State resources there. This is a few sort of practical tips for managing and responding to records requests. And I'll say, maybe I think those points are related. The key to successfully responding to records requests, particularly for electronic records, is to, in advance, have a plan for how you're going to manage your records. You know, I note if it's an email on agency business, it's a public record wherever the email is. Keeping stuff out of your personal email accounts and on the county systems is helpful. A big job is going to be finding records when a request come in. So using a descriptive subject line that helps with searching is a huge benefit. Keeping short email strings and limiting CCs, limiting reply all, it just cuts down on the number of emails that are out there and the number that you have to manage when you have a public records request. This slide sort of overlaps with the last one, but I think some of these points are worth making twice. It's that you have to have a policy, and following the policy is key. Preparation is key. Keeping documents to a single topic is key. I want to say more about this one. So there's no sort of there's not a Public Records Act exemption for like non-responsiveness. So for example, if you have an email that covers if you can imagine you start an email with your colleagues, with professional staff about one topic, and then that email conversation sort of evolves to talking about a second topic, and then it evolves to talking about a third topic. If you get a public records request for any of those topics, the whole email goes out, and sometimes the first topic can be boring, and you could have an email back but then you can imagine that then the email will say, I'm actually not worried about this first topic. I'm worried that this other thing is going to come up. And then there's some talk about this other thing. And then somebody can say, I'm actually worried about this third thing is going to come up. And then you get a request for the first boring topic. No sweat, that email goes out. The whole email is going to go out. So then people are going to learn about the second and third thing. So I think the really clear rule is one email, one topic. If you think of another topic, you start a new email thread. I think it's a huge sort of practical strategy to honor the obligations under the Public Records Act and give people the documents about things that they're asking about, but not to give them a bunch of stray stuff that's just going to create a distraction while they're at it. Don't say things that you don't mean, because whether it's intended to be ironic or funny or in jest or something, all that's going to get lost. It's just going to be in the words. So you need to sort of think about how your document's going to be received. Keeping stuff like organized in a logical manner is a huge benefit from the start when the requests come in. And related to that, and something that's like close to me, is like having a system for storing like attorney-client privilege documents and otherwise exempt documents. If you store them separately from the beginning, you're going to have a much more success asserting the exemption. If after the fact, when the request comes in, somebody's hunting through your emails trying to find the attorney-client privilege one, it's just futile. I mean, it's hugely difficult and just futile. You got to be on the lookout for sort of records requests. So sometimes we'll get like emails from stakeholders or constituents, and they'll be talking about this, and they're talking about that, talking about something else, and they'll say, oh, and by the way, I also want you to send me copies of these certain documents. There's probably a reasonableness requirement, but that's still a request, even if it's buried in other stuff. So you kind of got to be on the lookout for that. I've made my personal devices point a couple of times, and I think phoning a friend, like consulting with your colleagues, consulting with a clerk, consulting with your attorney is another key to success. Here's some other sort of like risk management strategies for Public Records Act. Having and I think most of these were sort of covered by the earlier points I made. Here's some important resources. The Attorney General, MRSC, the Mutual Research Service, they all have really excellent resources about setting up systems for successful responses to public records requests. I'll just spend I have a few minutes. I'll spend just a couple minutes on the appearance of fairness doctrine because it's, I think it used to be, it's not unimportant, but it used to play a bigger role for a couple of reasons. So the notion of the appearance of fairness doctrine, which is mostly a constitutional principle, kind of a due process related principle. The notion is that quasi-judicial decisions have to not only be fair.
Oh, mute him? He is muted. Sorry about that. He is muted. Okay, keep going.
For sure, not
Apologize.
quasi-judicial decisions have to be not only fair in fact, but they have to be fair in appearance. So there's like for like trial judges, there's a notion that judges can't be biased, that they can't have a personal interest in the outcome of the case, and they're very careful about following those rules. Appearance of fairness is sort of a layer. It's not just real fairness; it's like the appearance of fairness. So it's sort of it's a higher bar. There's kind of two scenarios where it comes up. One is, or two threads. One is if you have some sort of pecuniary or other interest in the decision, and ordinarily that speaks for itself, that you would, a quasi-judicial, either a hearing examiner or a legislative body sitting in a quasi-judicial capacity, you wouldn't weigh in on a hearing examiner wouldn't hear a case if the examiner had a financial interest in the outcome of the case. I mean, it's sort of obvious, but there's a couple twists I'll get to in a moment. But then the second main category is no ex parte communications, and that's of course particularly hard for legislative bodies that are all about ex parte communication, talking to people in the store and talking to people that they see at church and getting information from all. So that's fundamental to the legislative process. In fact, under the GMA's early and continuous public participation requirement, it might be required by the GMA that the legislative decision-making get information from all these sources. But for quasi-judicial decision-making, it has to be limited to the record. So what was developed during the hearing and what sort of documents were submitted. And getting ex parte communications is another appearance of fairness violation. Fortunately, the appearance of fairness doctrine doesn't apply to legislative decision-making. It only applies to quasi-judicial decisions. Increasingly, those decisions are delegated to hearing examiners who are sort of act like a judge, who are set up for protecting themselves from ex parte communications. But still, the appearance of fairness doctrine applies to them, and to the degree that legislative bodies might do a quasi-judicial decision every now and then, it would apply to them. Did I miss that? So the rule is no ex parte communications, and if you inadvertently get such a communication, there's a remedy. The statute describes a remedy. Disclose it on the record. Give the parties a chance to respond. If you disclose it on the record and they don't respond, they're barred from raising the challenge in the future. So it's really a complete solution. But it's important to go through that process, because if you did something that violated the appearance of fairness doctrine, it could void the action. It could potentially lead to a damages claim, and it's not really like a direct. It's more than like a direct penalty for violating the appearance of fairness doctrine. Plaintiffs, like a disappointed applicant or maybe a disappointed neighbor, will use the violation sort of as proof of like wrongdoing, and they've had some success with that. I'll come back to financial motive. As I said, I think most decision makers know that they wouldn't rule on a decision if they had a financial interest in the outcome. But the rule is potentially broader than you might think, and here's the case. So the city of Seattle they're doing a very contentious project that involves putting a trail through an already developed area. So the people around where the trail is going to now blast through their neighborhood were not excited about that. The sort of city elected officials generally supported it. I think most people knew that. There were a bunch of permit processes that they had to go through. They sent it to a hearing examiner. The city didn't even have their main hearing examiner do it, because that main hearing examiner thought they were disqualified, so they got a pro tem to do the hearing. The pro tem did the hearing, approved the project, went up on appeal. It turned out that the pro tem was actually applying for the job of becoming the permanent hearing examiner, and the neighbor's theory was that of course the permanent hearing examiner was going to be picked by the legislative body. The neighbor's theory was that pro tem was trying to curry favor with the elected officials by issuing a decision they would like, and that this fact that the pro tem was pursuing the permanent job hadn't been disclosed. I mean, strikes me as a kind of an attenuated, like financial interest theory, but the court said, the appearance of fairness doctrine is broad and it's it's sort of a rigorous standard, and the court remanded the matter for a new hearing. So I just, tell that story that like these things kind of come up in unusual ways, so you need to be sensitive to it. So, I think that's it.
Thank you, Darren. Sure. Any questions for Darren? All right, so we either wear you out after 2.5 hours of presidency, or we get lots of questions. Usually they're around the OPMA, but wore you out?
Questions? I think you guys covered it. Yeah. Well,
Thank you.
yeah, great job. Thank you.
This is your spot. I know what I'm doing.
Okay, there's no requested action tonight, and there's no need for an executive session. There being no further business and no objections, the meeting will be adjourned. Okay, hearing no objections, the meeting is now adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you.
That was Gamble.